Welcome to Regis World Literature. This is Lesson 20, the topic French literature, and our section today is on the classical age. Do not forget to take notes and to put this in your notebook and to study for quizzes and tests from it. So again, I will begin the reading here. We're going to break the section into three parts: the introduction, the forerunners, and the classical writers. The 17th century in France was known as the Grand Siècle. I'm going to pronounce it in English. Rather than the French, they have the Grand Cycle or the Grand, Siècle, or the Great Century. During this period, France emerged as the most important continental power and as the cultural leader of Western and Central Europe. The trend toward centralization of power in the French king was continued in the first half of the century under the influence of such strong ministers of state as Cardinal Richelieu and Cardinal Mazarin, and brought to its zenith in 1661 with the accession to the throne of Louis XIV, who became the symbol of absolute monarchy in Europe. The solemnity and formality of his court were translated into virtually every phase of French cultural life, including literature, painting, sculpture, and architecture. Under his rule, the French language replaced Latin as the principal language of diplomacy, the arts, the intellectual life. French styles and forms were imitated in the arts, and French thinkers were universally admired and revered. Interest in the forms and themes of classical antiquity awakened during the Renaissance was further heightened and refined in the 17th century. With the formation of the Académie Française by Cardinal Richelieu in 1635, the development of French language and literature was not left to chance but guided along established courses formulated by the Academy's august members. Departing from what many regarded as the personal excesses of Renaissance literature, 17th century French authors sought to express themselves with clarity and restraint in a serene, orderly, and reasonable fashion. However, both the strong individualism of the greatest French writers and the influence of the Baroque, which was sweeping through most of Europe, stressing motion, fluidity, and ornamentation, resulted in a wide range of imaginative and original expression within the accepted literary forms and styles of the period. So let me go ahead and give you some general notes here. Okay, here are your notes summarizing that. Recall, of course, that the classical period is the 17th century, which is the 1600s. It was known in France as the Great Century. France became the leader in continental Europe. Remember, continental Europe means the mainland of Europe, not including Scotland, Ireland, and England, of course. The apex, the symbol of absolutism in all of Europe, was Louis XIV, and we're thinking during his times and all the extravagant formalism, a flavor of solemnity, formality, style. Form was very critical, and so now here below this line, we're talking more the above the line general characteristics of the period. Below the line, this is more speaking of then the literature, really all the arts, but we're focused on the literature. We then want in the writing rules that they're expected to follow, formats, forms, strict stylistic ideas, and also the classical forms and themes. Classical now being used in a secondary way in this next statement, classical forms and themes referring to that of the ancient Greeks and Romans. So we are calling this the classical age, but they're also reaching back, just as they did in the Renaissance, even more so to the ideas of the Greeks and Romans about writing. But then there is this new tension between that and the Baroque. And the Baroque you see developing in music, and it has its influence in both the visual arts and literature, stressing both motion and ornamentation. Things that would not be, it's like an undercurrent, those would not be the basic emphases in classical writing, but it's like a counterpole that goes underneath it. And so you're influenced by that also. Now, the next section we're going to talk about are the forerunners. Early efforts to reform the French language were made by François de, and I do apologize for all my pronunciation, I'm very weak in that, de Malherbe, from 1555 to 1628, who sought to make it more precise, more pure, and more abstract. He also attempted to impose strict rules on versification, but was himself hardly an inspired poet. The two real precursors of the era of classicism were the philosopher René Descartes from 1596 to 1650 and the playwright Pierre Corneil from 1606 to 1684. Descartes was the founder of much of modern philosophy. His doctrine was one of rationalism, and he stressed the power of clear and lucid thought and of strength of will. He set down many of his principles in the Discours de la Méthode, or the Discourse of Method, published in 1637. The famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, or sum, I can't remember how it's pronounced, I think, therefore I am, was originated by him. Descartes also founded analytic geometry and wrote extensively on science. Other subjects that interested him were psychology and ethics. Very, very famous, impactful man of the last half of the 1500s and into the early 1600s. His books are well read today, especially when you take philosophy classes or things like that, or books or courses on, for instance, the history of thought or the development of thought. Corneille is often regarded as the founder of French tragedy. In his superbly structured plays, the development of the characters conditions all else. The crucial anguish aroused in the spectator is unmixed with any comic or vulgar element. The question is not what will happen, but how it happens, and with what consequences for the individual whose will, though it may be crushed by fate, remains superior to the forces that defeat it. And I think you can actually, in that description, recognize some of the emphasis of the Greek classics, and especially the Greek tragedies. Licide, Cinna, and Polyeucte, I cannot pronounce that, written between 1637 and 1642, are regarded as his masterpieces. A third man, Blaise Pascal, 1623 to 1662, was a child prodigy who, while still very young, made sensational experiments and discoveries in such fields as geometry and physics. Espousing the creeds of the Jansenists in his early 20s, he mocked and indicted the Jesuits, who were inclined to compromise with human frailty and to make allowances for each individual case. Hence, some were called how would you pronounce that? Casuists. Might have that wrong. In his Letters Provinciales in 1656 to 1657. His greatest work, however, is the incomplete Pensées, means reasons or thoughts, in 1670, published after his death. A collection of thoughts, maxims, and ideas of great beauty, and reflecting Pascal's deep faith. The Pensées, it's like being pensive, we take that word from that, suggests that man seek for the answers to the great questions of human existence, not in science, but in religion. The emotional force and the splendor of this work are unsurpassed in French literature. So he is also a tremendous Christian thinker. So let's go ahead and write these notes down. Okay, the notes here for Pierre Corneil, then, as he's the founder of French tragedy, he focuses on the character over the plot, or even a theme. The theme would be found within the uniqueness of the individual character. He has a tight structure or form, no mixture with comic or mundane, because he wants no distraction from the intense emotion he's trying to develop. He wants kind of like that Greek catharsis. He wants to keep your attentiveness. You felt that in Medea and some of these different plays you've read where the emotion just keeps ramping up, and they don't want anything to kind of deflate. Sometimes we get tired, you see, and so we pull down our emotion, but they want to ramp it up in levels and after level, so there's just one very keen effect on the emotion of the reader or the watcher. It's not focused on what happens, but on how and the superior force of human will over circumstances. And we do see, like I say, that he took a lot of that modeling from the classical Greek and Roman literature. Now, the third person is Blaise Pascal. And here are the summary of his notes. He's known for his work in geometry, in physics, and also his great work, Pensées, translated thoughts, a collection of thoughts, maxims, and ideas, really fundamentally pointing a person towards God as the foundation rock for all his understanding of the deep questions about life. Okay. Now, our next section is the classical writers. Louis XIV assumed power in France in 1661, and his absolute monarchy was the most advanced and most efficient government then in Europe. Only the writers who composed their works after 1661 may be grouped under what, long after their deaths, came to be known as classicism. So we mark the true chronological point of classicism with Louis XIV. These classical writers, quote unquote, shared the same aesthetic creeds and pursued the common ideal. Their keen insight into man's inner life and the perfection of their art restrained, eschewing all excess and flamboyance, and sparing in its use of literary devices. So again, there's nothing showy, right? It's a very restrained style. And sparing in its use of literary devices made them admired by French writers from Voltaire to Stendhal to Proust to Camus. One of the rules mistakenly believed to have invariably bound classical French dramatists is that of strict adherence to the three unities of time, place, and action in tragedy. Corneille occasionally flaunted these rules, as did the other great tragic dramatists of the 17th century, Jean Racine. For Racine, it was primarily the unity of interest that mattered. His 6 or 7 great tragedies, from Andromache to Phaedra, represent a triumph of architectural composition, of spare yet evocative poetry, and of psychological probing into the most fundamental passions: ambition, greed, the urge to domination, and most of all, love and jealousy. Racine often said that the only important rule in art was to please, and he sought to fulfill this precept intelligently by addressing himself to the most enlightened part of the public. So we're going to give you some notes on him as our first author of the true classical period. Okay, so here's our notes on Jean Racine. He is also a tragic dramatist along with Corneille, but again, a little later in time, so he actually qualifies, quote unquote, for the classical period. He also adhered in some regard with flexibility to the three unities of time, place, and action that were identified by the Greeks and written about when they thought of the model literature. But he says that the most thing that mattered most to him was unity of interest and pleasing the public. Now we're moving on to Molière. This same rule to address himself to the most enlightened part of the public was his audience. This rule was also followed by Molière, one of the greatest comic dramatists of all time. He succeeded in making all the faults and vices of men the butt for his ridicule. He unmasked all shams and lifted all the masks that profession, social hypocrisy, respectability, pedantry, snobbery, and avarice lead men to assume. He mercilessly ridiculed himself also. He could be farcical, even vulgar. He was able to integrate gestures, acrobatics, and off-color jokes into a comedy, provided that they had animation and the undefinable virtue of life. He also wrote serious comedies of manners and profound psychological dramas. Among his most famous plays, Tartuffe and Le Misanthrope in verse, and Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme Don Juan, and Le Malade Imaginaire in prose have remained the most universally popular. Okay, so there's our notes summarized in Molière, and now we're going to go on to de La Fontaine. An outstanding author in a different area was Jean de La Fontaine, who made the genre of the fable his own. With his fables, that genre became both a human and an animal comedy, a satire on man's arrogance, on his greed for power, and on his foolishness. La Fontaine's art is exquisite in its naturalness and ease, and in its subtle alliance of levity and seriousness. His poetry, which includes Adonis and lovely elegies, was didactic, lyric, even dramatic, and philosophical. It was once learned by heart by the French, as Homer's had been by the Greeks. Going on, it says, never perhaps did the art of French prose writing reach greater heights than during the classical era. So that's an era of prose. The novel was the last of the literary genres to acquire its own autonomy, pastoral and heroic at first, then crudely realistic and satirical. It discovered the full range of its possibilities as the heir to classical tragedy, only with the condensed, intensely introspective masterpiece, La Princesse de Clèves by Madame de La Fayette. And I'm moving on a little bit more. A friend of Madame de La Fayette's, Madame de Sévigné, is universally acknowledged as the queen of letter writers. Her letters to various friends, but in particular to her beloved daughter, Madame de Grignan, present a vivid picture of the court, of the provinces in which Madame de Sévigné traveled, as of family life and of maternal love. Her style is vivacious, sprightly, and free from all rules and restraints. A little bit different, although it's a mother-to-daughter letter genre, so it would not be expected to come under the same form that's typical of the classical era. A number of aristocrats who played a part in public affairs and objectively observed of the pomp, the ritual, and the masquerades of life at Versailles or at the court in Paris wrote introspective, picturesque memoirs. Among them were Cardinal de Retz, Madame de Maintenon, and especially the Duke de Saint-Simon, the greatest French writer of memoirs. Let's catch up a little on our notes then. Finishing out here, the two other literary forms that were treated with masterly originality in the classical age were maxims and religious polemics. The maxims are especially dear to the French, who call their creators moralists. After Pascal, the chief writers of maxims were La Rochefoucauld, whose maxims first appeared in 1665, and La Bruyère, whose caractères, while less acute than the other man's, are more varied and more bitter in their specific criticism of manners. Writers on religious themes produced works in the form of sermons, funeral orations, etc. The chief critics, so we have a critics develop. Okay, I think that we're finished with this section, all that I want you to know. The other, we're getting down to a little more obscure ideas. The three main authors of the classical period, the exact classical period would be Jean Racine, the tragic dramatist, and know the, if I give you names, know them, Molière, the comic dramatist, and Jean de La Fontaine with his Fables, which is actually the name of his work also, as well as lyric poetry. These last three ideas, the novel, the letters, and the memoirs, are being developed during this period and will certainly come to the forefront, especially the novel, in the 18th and particularly the 19th century. So that's all we have to do on this.